Thank you very much, Nod, and a very good morning to everyone, and a good afternoon and a good evening, depending on whichever part of the world you're signing in from. I will just share my screen. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to talk today about an ongoing project, which is part of my book monograph that I'm trying to write on the impact of environmental anomalies in the Indian Ocean world by comparing South Asia with Southeast Asia in the 17th and 18th centuries. There will be some overlaps with the previous lecture, but as you would find out, there will be lots of differences too. My talk today comprises of a couple of components. I will talk about the relationship between climatic anomalies and slavery. I will introduce the concepts of Little Ice Age, El Nino Southern Oscillation, Indian Ocean Dipole, and how did these impact patterns of enslavement in the Indian Ocean world, particularly in the networks of the VOC or the Dutch East India Company. Next, I will reflect on the relationship between slavery and diseases in the Indian Ocean world. And eventually, I will close off my talk with a few remarks on, if at all, what do the experiences of Dutch slavery in the 17th and 18th century tell us about the relationship between slavery, bondage, and environment in the Indian Ocean world? And if at all, it speaks to the debates on defining the current era of climate crisis. So, the Little Ice Age was a phase of average annual temperatures being cooler on each continent from about the 1400s to the mid-19th century. And it was a global event of varying spatial and temporal impact, which involved reduced migration of the intertropical convergence zone, frequent failures of South, Southeast, and East Asian monsoons due to El Nino Southern Oscillation events, and, as we have recently come to know, the Indian Ocean Dipole as well. The colder period of the Little Ice Age is sort of extended from the 1580s till the early 18th century, and this coincides with the expansion of the VOC in the Indian Ocean world. In other words, studying the VOC records and their correspondence is almost like an archive of the impact of Little Ice Age in the Indian Ocean world. So what was the VOC like in the Indian Ocean world? It was a major maritime power. It was a pacified merchant warrior in places like Persia and South Asia, with the exception of Malabar and Ceylon, China and Japan, and it was an aggressive colonizer in island Southeast Asia. In South Asia, Coromandel Coast, I will shortly point this out in a map. Coromandel Coast was a major source of textiles for the Southeast Asian markets of the VOC, and Ceylon and Malabar were conquered by the VOC from the late 1650s to monopolize trade in cinnamon and pepper. In Southeast Asia, the VOC conquered Batavia in 1619 and defended it against sieges in the next decade. In the island of Sumatra, the VOC entered into monopolistic agreements to supply pepper to it by the 1680s. The Moluccas, especially the Banda Islands, were conquered in 1621. The native population was expelled to monopolize production and trade in nutmegs, and Ambon area was subdued in the 1640s and early 1650s to monopolize trade in cloves. The sources I have used for today's talk include different components of the Overgekomen Brief en Papieren of the VOC, and this includes letters from Batavia to Amsterdam, correspondence from Coromandel to Batavia, and the Batavia Dagregister as well. So, this is what you see on your right side is the Coromandel Coast, where the VOC had a number of trading settlements from the early 17th century extending well into the late 18th century. Further down south, you have the island of Ceylon, conquered by the VOC in the late 1650s. And on the west coast, you have Malabar, which was also conquered, parts of which were conquered by the VOC from the late 1650s and early 1660s. The second region that will feature in today's talk is Java, which of course contained the Dutch capital of Batavia, present-day Jakarta in Indonesia. And finally, this is a map of the island groups of Moluccas in Ternate, where the VOC had more of a fortifying settlement to police its more southern possessions in Ambon and Banda. So how did ENSO or events like ENSO Indian Ocean Dipole affect the Indian Ocean world? The El Nino Southern Oscillation, as some of us might know, involves a differentiation in sea surface temperatures in the Pacific, which alternates or sort of diverts monsoon wind patterns across Asia and Australasia, leading to droughts in South Asia and Southeast Asia. The Indian Ocean Dipole is still a developing field of research, but in a way, its effects also parallel the impact of the El Nino Southern Oscillation. The Indian Ocean Dipole often involves, in the case of a positive dipole, upswelling of the sea surface temperatures and waters around the coasts of Sumatra and Java, which changes the direction of easterly winds, leading to droughts in eastern part of the Indian Ocean and heavy rainfall in the western part of the Indian Ocean. Throughout the colder part of the Little Ice Age, or the 17th century, the major El Nino Southern Oscillation events, as Richard Grove pointed out, were common in South Asia and Southeast Asia. For instance, this includes modern-day India, Burma, and the Indonesian archipelago, 1614 to 16, 1623-24, 2932, 1660, 62, 1685, 87. And there were a couple of weaker events in the 18th century, 1729 to 1732 and 1737 to 1739, which impacted parts of South Asia. But its impact on Southeast Asia is still something which is not very clear to me yet. The Indian Ocean Dipole, when it coincided with ENSO events like that of 1659-61, or on its own, for instance, 1674 to 75, could have devastating consequences for droughts in island Southeast Asia and far south of Coromandel, the Madurai region, and Malabar. So what is the relevance of ENSO IOD in the Indian Ocean world and its relevance in the context of the VOC, especially networks of enslavement? In South Asia, El Nino Southern Oscillation events and Indian Ocean Dipole often led to droughts, disrupting textile production, resulting in flight of weavers, mortalities, and enslavement of humans. This pattern persisted throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. In Southeast Asia, too, it's related to droughts and mortalities, especially among the enslaved workforce in the spice gardens. We could also relate our study of ENSOs and IODs in the Indian Ocean world with debates on 17th century climatic and politico-economic crisis, as has been argued by Geoffrey Parker in several of his works. In the context of South Asia, there is no recurring mortality despite droughts and famines, while in Southeast Asia, there was an economic crisis around 1640s. Dutch colonialism reduced Asian merchants to small-scale traders. Nevertheless, Southeast Asia does not experience famines of the same scale as South Asia, but it experiences mortalities due to diseases. The question that I'm trying to pose to these climatic anomalies is, could slavery in the networks of the VOC be a barometer to assess the human impact of climatic anomalies in the Indian Ocean world? There have been several works on slavery on the Indian Ocean and particularly in the context of the VOC. Indian Ocean slavery, for a start, is of course less studied in comparison to the Atlantic. And there has been argument that Coalescence of climatic anomalies with other factors like deaths and warfare often led people to bondage in the Indian Ocean world. In the context of the Dutch Empire, there have been studies on how it ensured forced migration of humans, for instance, in the work of Gary Ward or Marcus Wink, who called it the world's oldest trade. There have been studies on backgrounds, origins, and destinations of slaves by Mbeki, Rossum, Robert Ross, Nigel Warden, including works on demographic composition by Gerrit Knaap for the Moluccas and Pepijn in Bosma on the impact of slavery in the Dutch Republic. The historiographical intervention that I propose is to study interrelationship between climatic anomalies, humans, and diseases in order to rethink questions of slavery, bondage, and environment in the Indian Ocean world. And in order to do so, I will use examples from Coromandel Coast and Malabar in South Asia and Moluccas in island Southeast Asia during the 17th and 18th centuries. Slaves were a major feature of the logic of colonial expansion in island Southeast Asia from the early 17th century. As early as the 1620s, after depopulation and conquest of Banda, the VOC Governor General Jan Pieterszoon Koen recommended procuring slaves from Ceylon, Coromandel, and Bay of Bengal to man and fortify the VOC colonies in Batavia, Ambon, and Banda. Batavia reported in December 1622 about 1,000 slaves arrived from the Coromandel coast, of which 200 were sent by February 1623 by Batavia to the spice gardens of Ambon and Banda. This pattern of enslaved labor from the Coromandel coast to island Southeast Asia, as well as elsewhere, persisted throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. And it's an indicator to think about the human impact of climatic anomalies in the Indian Ocean world. For instance, I will compare two cases of coeval climatic anomalies and their impact on slavery in the Indian Ocean world from the latter half of the 17th century. The 1659 to 1661 El Nino Southern Oscillation and IOD in South Asia. It resulted in severe drought and famine in Coromandel from 1659. This was followed by serious depopulation caused by starvation and diseases, which included but were not limited to dysentery and fevers around Masulipatam. In Coromandel, weavers died of starvation and survivors migrated. The southern part of Coromandel, especially the area of Tanjore, which was a rice-producing part, was devastated by the famine in the wake of 1659 Enzo. Transmission occurred from corpses, and the Dutch reported, no surprises there, humans enslaved themselves to ensure food security. On a comparative framework, in island Southeast Asia, northern Moluccas around the same time reported deaths due to diseases in Ternate. In southern Moluccas, droughts were reported in Ambon and Banda in 1660, which was related to poor harvest of cloves in Ambon, and the clove gardens in Ambon experienced serious depopulation, particularly that of enslaved labor. Although droughts affected Java around the same time, but there was no famine. Slavery, as we find from the VOC records, connected the climatic experiences of South and island Southeast Asia. For instance, in December 1660, Batavia reported the arrival of 295 slaves from Pulicat in Coromandel. Another 100 slaves were sent from Masulipatam in Coromandel to Batavia, while 400 more were available to be shipped again. By late 1660 and early 1661, the VOC in Batavia decided to supply the spice gardens of Ambon with slaves shipped from the Coromandel coast. The logic was to repopulate the spice gardens with slave labor and replant the clove trees. Clearly, this is a case where coeval climatic anomalies that impacted different parts of the Indian Ocean world had a connecting link in the movement of enslaved labor. Apart from island Southeast Asia, Coromandel also supplied slaves to Ceylon, another newly conquered colony of the VOC. The number of slaves available in Coromandel for being transported to island Southeast Asia or Ceylon dwindled by 1661 due to serious depopulation of the region. This pattern repeated itself yet again in 1685 and 1687, which was a serious Enzo event in South Asia. Coromandel experienced drought from the second half of 1685 till late 1686, followed by floods in 1687. Destruction of crops along with warfare. This coincided with the southern military campaigns of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, resulted in diminishing food security. Severe famine and depopulation followed in Coromandel, around Masulipatam and Pulicat due to diseases like fevers, diarrhea, and smallpox. Survivors migrated to the southern part of the coast, including textile weavers, and humans were enslaved yet again to ensure food security. In island Southeast Asia, this event impacted on Java in 1686 and 1687, as well as in Sulawesi and Sumbawa in the form of droughts and poor harvests. In the Moluccas, especially in Banda, more than droughts, it was a case of heavy precipitation, followed by droughts in some parts like Kisar, which experienced a 10-month-long drought resulting in loss of livestock. Nevertheless, no serious famines were reported in Sumatra or Java, but deaths are reported due to diseases like fevers and smallpox in Sumatra, Banda, and in Batavia. Connections similar to 1659-61 event yet again developed between South Asia and Southeast Asia through slavery. Let's look at a few estimates. For instance, by 1686, the Dutch reported having large number of slaves in Coromandel. It's sort of a figurative term. Slaves available in hundreds. But by 1687, we have more concrete numbers. For instance, 88 slaves were shipped by the VOC from Coromandel to Ceylon, 360 in Pulicat, and by the middle of the year, another 300 in Pulicat, which were meant for shipments to Batavia and Ceylon, including another 250 for Ceylon and another 250 for Batavia. There is evidence of non-Dutch trade in slaves as well from Coromandel around the same time. This includes networks of private traders who were probably indigenous, and even the English East India Company that shipped slaves to Aceh in Sumatra. I think I have 4 minutes. Anyway, I'll finish this. There is further evidence for climatic anomaly-induced enslaved labor in the 18th century from South Asia. 1729 to 31 was a weak Enzo event. Famine appeared in southern Coromandel by late 1729. Deaths were reported due to starvation, and the ruler of Tanjore prohibited shipment of grains. Nagapatnam delivered about 182. By 1730, the effects of the famine extended to Malabar as well. 212 slaves for Batavia. Batavia demanded another 100 slaves from Malabar for 1731, which tells us that slaves remained available in fairly large numbers in Malabar till the mid-1730s. Yet again, by the mid-1730s, the VOC reports shipping 283 slaves from Cochin in Malabar to Sumatra, a good number of which died en route. 1737 to 39, another extreme Enzo event resulted in profusion of slaves in Malabar. Batavia requested for about 500. Malabar could only buy 200 of them, many of whom died. There was yet another weak Enzo event reported from 1746 to 48, which resulted in an almost 3-year-long drought. But Interestingly, no shipment of slaves are reported in these years. While climatic anomalies could impact while one aspect of human impact of climatic anomalies could be in enslaving people who had no recourse to a decent food security, another angle to rethink the relationship between slaves and environment is in looking at slaves themselves as agents of transmission of diseases. This is by no means novel in the context of the Dutch East India Company. It was experienced earlier as well in the Indian Ocean world in 13th and 14th century, Mongol imperial trade networks that facilitated transmission of Black Death. But we find clear references of transmission of smallpox from in the Indian Ocean world due to slave trade. For instance, 1644, slaves afflicted with smallpox arrived in Batavia from Arakan, and by February 1644, Batavia experienced a general outbreak of smallpox. Almost another 1,000 slaves arrived from Arakan later in the year, many afflicted with smallpox. Even in 1685, 1687, many slaves were afflicted with smallpox in Coromandel, while the VOC waited for the disease to wane before shipping them to Batavia. In the 18th century, the VOC developed more concrete policies on not transporting slaves afflicted with smallpox. Batavia experienced an outbreak of smallpox in the late 1680s, which probably occurred through movement of enslaved labor from Coromandel. And in the 1730s, the VOC bought about 200 slaves in Malabar for Batavia, many of whom died, and the VOC decided to not ship the survivors till they recovered from smallpox. 1755, yet again, a case of smallpox in the Cape Colony in southern Africa, and the VOC decided to not transport any slaves afflicted with smallpox except those that had recovered on the company's ships to prevent transmission. So what does this mean in general for slavery, bondage, and environment in the Indian Ocean world? Though faceless, movement of enslaved labor reflects the human impact of climatic anomalies. While figures are sketchy, they could be staggering in a year of serious climate crisis, ranging from 500 to 1,000, and even in a year of weak ENSO, there could be substantial number of slaves ranging between 200 to 500. This reveals the existence of private trading networks in the IOW that procured slaves for European mercantile colonial powers. What could this tell us about the debates on Anthropocene or Plantationocene? So the idea of Plantationocene, which is premised upon the study of plantations, reflects on the role of a monocrop plantation, regimes of forced labor, and sustenance of a racialized elite to engage with questions of climate change. The development of Dutch colonialism in the Indian Ocean world, especially Moluccas, bears striking resemblances with the idea of the Plantationocene. The question that we should ask ourselves is, were early modern climatic anomalies-driven enslaved labor the predecessors of modern climate refugees? That's where I will stop. Thank you very much.